So having spent a bit of time looking through topics of God's will and how do you make decisions, we're going to turn now to looking at the theology of work, which sounds like quite a mouthful, I know, but hopefully this will be really helpful for you. Like maybe actually you're kind of in your final year of uni, you're thinking just about study, final year, you're not thinking at all about work, don't blame you. But I just encourage you, again, I've kind of included this topic in this module for final years because I think it's really important to process, because I know when I went into my first year of work, like I kind of felt like I'd done the academic educational conveyor belt and just went straight into the world of work, and I just had to focus on I felt like I didn't know anything, and I was just trying to learn, focus on how to get the job done without not having to ask too many people questions, and I kind of just went straight into it and didn't really spend much time in my first year of work thinking through is this what I should be doing? How do I feel like God comes into this? Am I doing the right thing? Should I be doing something else? I just remember something going into the midst of work and being overwhelmed by it. And it's not only been kind of in the sort of subsequent years, so I've been able to reflect a bit more on it as to, do I feel called to this? Is this what God has for me? How am I growing in my gifts? How am I blessing others through that? And how does God come into the mix in my work? So I think it's really helpful for you to, during your final year of uni, to just reflect a bit on this and think through what is it that you want to devote yourself to. And I wouldn't put too much pressure on yourself on that. It's not like you have to come up with the answer of this is my career plan, this is what I know I want to do after uni. Far more important than the what of what you're going to do is thinking through what are your values, what do you feel God's called you to be, and what maybe the things you're going to try out after this final year of uni to explore that more with God. And I should just say at the beginning, when I'm talking about work in this video, I'm not just talking about things you get paid for. I'm not talking about a career plan and something that you get a salary for that you do 5 days a week. Maybe it is that, but when I'm talking about work, I'm talking about anything that you devote and give your time to after your time of education. The world of education, is this time in your life where it does change, obviously, as you go through different parts of schooling and uni, but it's kind of one phase of your life. And then after education, and if you don't stick in academia, whether you're working for a charity or a business, whether you changing between different types of jobs or doing one long sort of career, it's very different. And also you studied for however many years that you've just done, but you've got decades ahead of you of doing, well, it could be anything. I remember it feeling quite daunting when you kind of look at your time after uni, you're well, what do I do? What do I devote my energy to? And whether you're paid to do that or not, your work and sort of bringing God into that is so important. And in our kind of Western culture, there is a bit of a divide between the secular and the sacred, where we kind of think about people who do churchy things or Christian things, whether that's volunteering for a charity or a church or whatever, as being oh well, that's one option, or I do something that earns me money and is a job. And maybe some of you are sort of considering that even in your final year, do I do something for God, or do I just go into the career path that I had been thinking of? And what I'd love in this session is to try and break that down a little bit and see actually that there isn't a choice of either or, that actually work, whether that's paid or not paid, is something that's God-given that we pursue. And we can't afford to have that divide, because otherwise, if you go into a typical job, maybe you have your quiet time in the morning, Sunday church and a Bible study or something midweek, that's not really enough. God needs to fill all your time in that. If 60, 70, 80% of your waking time is working, is giving your time to something, doing that for decades, you want that to be God-filled. You want that to be part of God's kingdom work, and processing what that means for you is really important. So I just wanted to mainly focus on looking at some passages right at the beginning of page 1 of the Bible in Genesis 1. Now, Genesis 1, 2 and 3 are, I remember when I first became a Christian, was reading through these passages. There's loads of weird stuff in there, talk about 7-day creation, how does that fit in with science? There's a talking snake, what's that about? There's all these kind of things in Genesis that, in the creation account, that can almost be a bit of a distraction, lots of great topics to look at in that, but in some ways become a distraction from the main meaning of the creation narrative. And the creation narrative, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, like is trying to get at the core of who God is, why He's made us, and what He's made us for, and especially around this area of work. And maybe when I mentioned work and Genesis, you probably think, well, work is probably that thing that came in after, God made the perfect world. Adam and Eve were chilling out in the garden. It was all rosy and perfect. They then sinned, and then they were kicked out. And then after that, work was this curse that they had to, they were no longer being taken care of in this perfect, idyllic place by God. Therefore, they had to work really hard from then on. Well, actually, that's not the way that work is talked about in the creation account. It's actually in Genesis 1, so before the fall, work comes up. It's part of who we were made to be. So Genesis 1 verse 28 says, this. It says, God blessed them. God said to them, that's to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So I'll just sort of take that bit by bit. So be fruitful and multiply. That basically, it means make babies, but more than make babies, it means go and make community. Fill the earth with community. Go and make culture. Go and make distinct communities that represent Him. There's this idea of multiplication, going out and creating community and culture. Filling the earth and subdue it. Subdue kind of has a bit of negative connotation in our language today, but what it means by that is taking what could be barren and chaotic and giving it order. So in Genesis 1, where God's creating the world, it talks about how things were wild and waste. There's this kind of chaoticness to the world, that God, it says that He spoke and then He divides things, whether that's light from darkness or the waters. He divides things and gives them order and structure, and then He sees that it's good. That what happens in Genesis 1 is that there is this chaos that then God divides and orders into beautiful things that reflect His glory. And then He makes humanity in His image, and basically He's telling them to do the same, to subdue. What He's talking about there is saying, take what could be chaotic and make it ordered and beautiful. And He says, have dominion over, and He mentions the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So He's talking about, in the Jewish world, this was the three-part cosmos of sky, seas, and earth. Basically, it's a way of saying have dominion over everything. He's saying the entire universe, you are to have dominion over it. God is giving over authority to humanity to step up, to rule, to take on what He's created and take it somewhere. Not here's a perfect garden, chill out. No, take it somewhere. There's raw potential for you to take and make something of. And that's expressed even more later on in chapter 2, verse 15. It says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. And as I've already mentioned, I probably, first of all, thought that, working and taking care of the Garden of Eden probably just meant, deadheading a flower every now and then, or, doing a bit of weeding at the weekend. But actually, the language that's used here when it uses the word work is actually more like a kind of farming term. It's about, there's raw potential in the earth, but it's kind of, there's not much to it. You've got to create something out of it. You've got to work. You've got to put effort into it. And if you put that effort into the land, something can come of it. And that's what God made Adam and Eve for. He didn't create something perfect and let them sit still. Actually, He wanted them to work it, to take it somewhere, to do something with it. And that's the picture we have throughout Scripture. So Genesis 1 is about the garden. Then in Revelation, we read about the city of God. There's this idea that it kind of progresses from this small garden to suddenly the city where all the nations come. Creation was always supposed to go somewhere. And sometimes we think of Garden of Eden being the ideal, and then human sinned, and now we're in this situation where we need saving from Jesus, and he's going to take us back to the garden. And actually, no, it's not about taking us back to the garden, it's taking us forward to the city, and that's something that God isn't just doing by Himself, He's wanting us to participate in through our work. But then we do have Adam and Eve sin. They turn away from trusting in God, and it reflects then on their mandate to work the land. So chapter 3 verse 17 says this. It says, cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you'll eat from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground. So work was a God-given thing. It was a gift. But after Adam and Eve sin, after they sin, it's as if that work suddenly becomes frustrated. So that ground that they were supposed to be working on, that had all that potential, it's now become cursed, and they're still supposed to work it. They're still supposed to put that effort in. But it's almost like it's now become frustrated, and there's extra work there's extra effort you need to put into it. But also, it's not necessarily a given that the effort you put in is something good's going to come out of it. Like farming is notoriously dependent on things always going wrong, and there's this idea that work for all of humanity now has become it's frustrated. It's still a good given gift from God, but actually often you put effort in something and then it goes wrong, and you don't get your return for the effort that you put in. Work is now cursed. But before I kind of talk a little bit more on that, I wanted to go to one other part in Scripture that talks about work. And it's maybe one that you haven't come across before, or if you have, you probably haven't thought of it in this context. It's Exodus 31, where God is giving instructions to the Israelites on how to build His altar, and it says this in verse 1 of chapter 31 of Exodus. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Ur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of crafts." Now, the reason why this passage is really important is this is the first time in the Bible that we read of someone being specifically filled with the Spirit of God. So it's the first time, and every time that something happens for the first time in the Bible, it's always like a key moment. It always says a lot. And, it's the first time someone being filled with the Spirit, and you would have thought, well, that's probably someone being filled with the Spirit to pray, or to prophesy, or to give a sermon. Actually, this is someone being filled with the Spirit to be a craftsman, to make something really beautiful, to take raw potential of what they have around them and to make something really beautiful. And that's the picture that the Bible gives us of what work is. It's about taking where there is potential, using our God-given image to order things, to create something that is beautiful, that glorifies God. Like God cares in this moment that what is made is beautiful, and He fills this guy Bezalel with His Spirit in order to do it. So that is what God cares about. Now, obviously, as you go later through the Bible to the Gospels, and you read through the story of Jesus, and you have the Great Commission before He ascends to heaven, He gives the Great Commission to His disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. And this is probably where some of our secular spiritual divide comes up, especially when we think about work, because we know that going and making disciples of all nations, that's the mandate. That's what we should be doing, right? If we're Christians, that should be the be-all focus of going out, making disciples, telling people about Jesus. That's all we should do. And if we're doing work, that's kind of like a necessity in order to earn some money. But really, we should be giving our focus on that. Now, totally, our primary focus should be that. Making disciples is our core calling. But John Mark Comer's book, Garden City, and I'd really recommend you read Garden City by John Mark Comer. It's really good. He talks about this and says that we have the Great Commission from Jesus to go and make disciples, but that doesn't negate, or it doesn't take away the first commission that humanity is given in Genesis 1 that we just looked at, to fill the earth, to subdue it, to make something, to have dominion and to create and to work it. And he says that actually we carry both of those vocations, both of those are in all of us. The vocation to work and to make something beautiful, to take what could be unordered potential and to make something of it that reflects God's glory. We are made to take things somewhere. That is a God-given vocation that we're all to do, and we're to make disciples. And we don't choose one or the other. Actually, as followers of Jesus, we do both at the same time. And I'd love to talk about more about that in our group discussions as to how that works out in our life. But just to end with, I wanted to just mention one key thing that kind of helps us keep this in a healthy balance in our life. So I've talked about how work is a God-given gift. It's not something to be shunned as a necessity if you have to. Actually, it's something that God calls us to. But in the culture that we live in, it can become an obsession and almost like the basis of our identity. And in the Old Testament, when God is talking about the discipline of the Sabbath, of keeping one day a week holy and not working on that day, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses talks about the keeping the law of the Sabbath, and he relates it to the reason why they should do it. He relates it to their time when they were back slaves in Egypt, and says the reason why you need to keep the Sabbath is to remind yourselves that you're no longer under Pharaoh. And when the Israelites were in Egypt, when they were under Pharaoh, they were slaves. They had to work. They never had any rest. And basically the culture they lived in was just all around productivity. It was all about making as much as they possibly could, and they were just forced day in, day out to work, to produce, to make. But then they were set free by God. Now, when God set them free, he didn't say, well, now you no longer have to work. They still worked. They still had that original commission from Genesis 1 to go and make things. But humanity can so easily, because work is cursed, as we read in Genesis 3, because it's cursed, we can fall into this default where it becomes our identity or our purpose. It becomes the thing, the all-encompassing thing that is forming our identity. And the practice of Sabbath is for us to realise that we're not defined by our work. Yes, it is a God-given gift that we're given to do, and we should pursue that, but it's not at the core of who we are, and therefore the practice of Sabbath reminds us every week that we are not bound by our work, that's not what sets us in relation with God. Actually, that's secure in Him, separate from our work. So just as you're kind of processing some of these ideas, just think through as well how your rhythms of rest and Sabbath link in for you at the moment in your walk with Jesus, and hopefully we can talk about that in our group session as well.